again, the mind-body connection in the field of neuroimmunology, we know that when you access your most positive feelings, and flow is among them, and more specifically, the sense of mastery that comes with flow and the sense of control that you come with flow. These are two of the most positive feelings humans can get. And whenever we get really positive emotions, especially these two, it amplifies the production of T cells, which fight off disease, and natural killer cells, which are the cells that target tumors and other sick cells. So you've got like serious immunological function. Even more importantly, as we move into a flow state, stress hormones get flushed out of our system. Why is this a big deal? There are 9 known causes of aging. What do they have in common? Inflammation. All of them are problems that are related to inflammation. What causes inflammation? Predominantly stress. So anytime you can fight stress, fight inflammation, this is powerful anti-aging technologies, and flow does all of this stuff.
Welcome back to the Mind Meld, my friends. And speaking of the mind, if you've been listening, if you've been watching for any length of time, you know that that is a topic that I am deeply fascinated in, the nature and power of the mind in general. And our guest in this one, Steven Kotler, is a wealth of knowledge where that's concerned, particularly in the areas of neuroscience, positive psychology, flow states, and how to apply all of the above to attain peak performance. And his new book, in particular, takes a look at the link between the mind and longevity, and there is some absolutely shocking, staggering information in that tome where that's concerned, even for a wonder dipper like me. So I think some of the information in this episode is going to surprise you. And speaking of which, this one is just an absolute torrent, barrage of knowledge, of practical, applicable wisdom. If you don't know the brilliant Steven Kotler, he's the best-selling author of numerous books, Art of the Impossible, Stealing Fire, just to name a couple of my favorites, and his latest, Gnar Country, in which Steven himself was the guinea pig for a lot of these concepts I just mentioned in a very visceral, physical, real way. The keyboard mudras you need for Steven's new book, and all things Steven Kotler, are in the description. And with that, friends, let's just get into this Wonder Dip. But first, do take a moment to tickle the algorithm here on YouTube with a like, with a sub. It is vitally important for increasing the circumference of our psychic splash. We also have over 300 audio-only podcasts that are never going to be posted to YouTube, that you can only get on your pod platform of choice. So do subscribe wherever that may be. Also, come join the Third Eye Drops Patreon Wonder Dip for patron exclusive virtual hangs. We have guests from the show in our Wonder Gym. You get to interact with me, with them, with a bunch of other fabulous human beings. You can also get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. And it's the best way to support the show and your pal, Michael P. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with the wise, the wonderful, the brilliant Steven Kotler. One of my favorite authors on the planet, Steven Kotler. I really loved your last book, in particular, Art of the Impossible. We read it in my Patreon book club. I pulled from it for some videos I did. So always love rapping with you. Excited about this new project too. I love that. I love that you put your balls out there on this one, that you really just went for it and used yourself as the guinea pig. Cause that's, at some point, I guess you either do it or you don't, like you point out early on in the book.
What's funny is I've been the guinea pig all along for all this stuff, right? I'm always running these experiments on myself first. I just don't assume that what works for me will work for anybody else, because that doesn't tend to be true scientifically. There's a lot of reasons why it's not true, but I have to run the experiment myself anyways, because if I can't get it to work for me, I can't learn enough about the nuance to be able to use it with other people. This is just the first time I've made the experiment really visible.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I was thinking about, there's an obvious through line with all of your work, at least your nonfiction work, being, applied flow, positive psychology, But underneath it all, there's a more basic through line, which is just, I think, the power of the mind. And I think this book, obviously all of those things orbit this book, but this one really, I think, in some different ways, highlights the power of the mind. I mean, like from aging being a mental process to all of these like limitations that are, if not self-inflicted, they're societally inflicted upon us, and they infect our mind, and we start to believe that, well, I'm X age, I guess I can't do this anymore. I'm X age, I guess it's time to do this. And you really show in this book that that is, maybe it's not a fantasy, maybe that's a strong word, but it's optional to an extent, for sure.
You are definitely so when you are definitely right. Right, one of the biggest findings in peak performance aging and uh, is how much of a mental process. The way I like, aging is a fact of life. Old is a mindset, very, very, very clearly, and it's a mindset with huge impact on our physical well-being. That's the lesson you find over and over and over in this field is about the mind-body connection in shockingly weird ways. Like shockingly weird ways, even for me, who came in feeling like this was, this connection was really, really strong. But like the more you sort of peel back the layers on peak performance aging, the more you start to kind of figure out how much of a mental event it is. I'll give you two crazy examples that are sort of a little related, or three crazy examples. One is just the standard research on mindset, and this is work that goes back to Ellen Langer's work in the 70s
Mm-hmm.
at Harvard, right, 80s. But for example, the Ohio study of longitudinal study of aging over time is this 20-year study. It gets started in 1975, runs through 1995. And they do, Becca Levy and a team at Yale does a meta-analysis on it to try to figure out how much does a positive mindset towards aging actually impact health and longevity. And a positive mindset towards aging is literally, I'm excited about the second half of my life. I think my best days are ahead of me. The result, and this is duplicated again and again, is that a positive mindset towards aging results in another 7.5 years of healthy longevity. That's
Yeah.
wild. That means you can be morbidly obese and have a shitty mindset towards aging. And it is more important to change your mindset than to lose weight for health and
Wow.
longevity. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Really?
So that's wild. Another one, this is also crazy. One of the things I say is the research is interesting because the research is that interventions at any age, even into your late 80s, and by the way, it's probably farther than that, but most of the studies, when you're talking about older adults, sort of end in their 80s, right? Like you don't really get a lot of studies on 90-year-olds or
True.
100 years old. So like, that's the limit on our research, not on possibility spaces, but interventions even into your late 80s really, really matter. But peak performance aging also starts young. There's a bunch of stuff, and it's all psychological that you need to start thinking about in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s. I'll give you one random example. One of the most famous studies on aging, and it sort of kicked off, I think, the real work that became peak performance aging. It was all the work done on the Sisters of Notre Dame, this sort of nationwide organization, Catholic organization, and all the nuns involved really, really interested in education, peak performance aging, all this stuff. They donated their time and their brains to science. They got cognitive tests every year. They got physical tests every year. When they died, their brains were autopsied, et cetera, et cetera. They were trying to figure out what leads to cognitive decline, what leads to Alzheimer's, dementia, and what factors are neuroprotective and lead to thriving late in life.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the nuns had to do was when they entered the sisterhood, they wrote a biographical essay. It's about a paragraph long.
Hmm.
And it's, this is where I came from and this is what I'm hoping for. And the average age was 22 when they wrote these essays. They realized that they could analyze these essays for optimism in the language, and that the level of optimism you have in your 20s correlates to health and longevity in your 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. In
Wow.
fact, the sisters who were the most optimistic in their 20s lived an additional 10 years than the others, like 70, 50, 60 years later. So not only is there these like wild mind body impacts, they're wild across the lifespan, right? How you think in your 20s and your 30s is has a huge impact on late in life. And the final thing I want to say, how you think about your later years, how you talk about your later years is really important at a cultural level. So ageism is the most widely held prejudice in the world, right? Think almost any other prejudice these days. I walk outside, I trot it out, and you're going to cancel me. But ageism, I can literally look at you and be like, you're too old for this shit. And nobody even blinks. Totally acceptable. And yet,
Yeah.
work done on stereotypes. People exposed to negative stereotypes are on aging in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. When they look at the impact in their 60s on memory, people who grew up around like positive tolerance for older people and cross generational friendships, that those sorts of communities do incredibly well in their later years. People who grow up around negative stereotypes of aging, by the time they're 60, you see a 30% greater decline in memory.
Wow.
So it's really like how we talk about older adults has a huge impact on the quality of their life, thanks to like these really tight, like we can go on and on and on. I could talk for the next hour on this topic, but I'll stop there and let you ask another question.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, and that really backs up in a slightly different way, I guess, everything. I'm also interested with positive psychology because you look at these meta analyses of like positive affect and the impact that has on health. And basically you see all cause mortality goes down, like improve cardiovascular health, lower instances of all kinds of mental illnesses, of course. So there's that. And then this also, in a slightly different way, I recently talked to Robert Waldinger, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard,
Sure.
who runs the longest running study on human thriving. And so much of it indirectly echoes what you're saying, because I don't think maybe they are asking them about positive affect and how they feel and if they feel positive, but it's all of these things that positive psychology also looks at, like the quality of your relationships, like, you know, how you are able to talk to your spouse, whether or not your spouse supports you in life changes, and like whether you have a group of friends and all of these things. And clearly these are like directly related to all of these things. So yeah, that really stood out to me. But I guess, where did this, it's just ingrained in the zeitgeist, in the culture, that this you can't teach an old dog new tricks idea. And you do start to see it infect people at young ages. Like this idea, people who are 30 start to think they're old. People who are 40 start to think they're old. And then it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy. Like they think they're old, so they don't exercise anymore, and then they don't exercise anymore and they feel worse. And it's just like, but really it's all it starts right up here. It starts in the mind with some notion that gets implanted somehow. But is that a
Well, it's
science
interesting. We
thing? Like,
actually know. So just to put a little context around this and to talk about the origin story behind this.
yeah.
So the old idea, the traditional idea of aging is the long, slow route theory. It's the idea that all of our mental skills and our physical skills decline over time. There's nothing we can do to stop the slide. That what we now know, that new research, and it's very, very clear that all the skills that we used to think declined over time, we now know they're use it or lose it skills. And if you never stop training these skills, you get to hang on to them and even advance them far later
Mm.
in life than anybody thought possible. So the question has been, where did this long, slow route theory really come from? And it's actually the same place as the idea that an old dog can't learn new tricks. 1907. It's 1907. I always think it's 1904, but I think it's 1907. Freud is about to turn 50 and he's
Oh yeah.
scared to death, doesn't want to turn 50. And so he writes famously that basically don't even, I'm paraphrasing the beginning. He says, don't even try psychotherapy with anybody over the ages of 50. They're too far over the hill. They're too stuck in their ways. Old people are no longer educable. And that's the quote. And that's the origin of you can't teach an old dog new tricks. It goes back to Freud. And what's interesting is we spent most of the last century proving Freud right, right? I mean, from like, he says it in 1907, by like 1995, all we've done is figured out all the ways Freud is right, right, in incredible detail. And then around 1995, and it starts with some of these, like the Ohio study, longitudinal study I talked about, got started in 75, finishes in 95. The Sisters of Notre Dame, those results start showing up in the 90s. And these are the things that start overturning this idea, but we're really still stuck with it across the boards, and and a lot of things. And the other thing that I want to say, that I think is interesting, is if you sort of summarize what is peak performance aging in a single sentence, it's, if you want to rock till you drop, you want to regularly engage in challenging, creative, and social activities that demand dynamic, deliberate play and take place in novel outdoor environments.
Hmm.
The reason I wanted to mention that sentence in conjunction to what we've been talking about is most of those terms, and I can define them more and we can get into them, but most of them are psychological. Those are psychological interventions. And when most people think about peak performance aging, they're thinking about, how do I tinker with my diet, or what supplements do I take, or the biotechnology, regenerative medicine revolution, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying those things aren't real, but I'm saying the biggest levers that we currently have at our disposal are predominantly psychological, and they're huge. They're huge levers that make an enormous difference. So I think that most of us think about this wrong. Not only do we have the long, slow rot theory wrong, we have our list of interventions are also not the ones that we want to be reaching for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I recall from our previous conversation and your previous book that novel outdoor environments are also highly correlated to flow. Like these are flow triggers, right? Like being in new areas
So
that, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so of that statement, challenging,
Yeah.
creative, social, these are all flow triggers. Novelty is a flow trigger. There's a lot of flow triggers built in, and there's a reason. So flow science, actually, one of the reasons that I got into this peak performance aging world is because flow science runs smack through the middle of it. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the godfather of flow psychology, he's most known for his flow work and his creativity work. But what most people don't realize is he's wrote 6 or 7 textbooks on adult development and
Wow.
flow, because flow is one of the major drivers of adult development. When we're on the other side of a flow state, because we have to use our skills to the utmost. So we grow, right? We gain new skills. We're more adaptable, more complex, and flow automatically expands empathy and wisdom. These are maturation characteristics. Flow is one of the big drivers of adult development. So the work runs smack through this, but more importantly, one of the reasons you see so much flow in the peak performance aging kind of playbook is that, again, the mind body connection in the field of neuroimmunology. We know that when you access your most positive feelings, and flow is among them, and more specifically, the sense of mastery that comes with flow and the sense of control that you come with flow. These are two of the most positive feelings humans can get. And whenever we get really positive emotions, especially these two, it amplifies the production of T cells, which
Hmm.
fight off disease, and natural killer cells, which are the cells that target tumors and other sick cells. So you've
Wow.
got like serious immunological function. Even more importantly, as we move into a flow state, stress hormones get flushed out of our system. There's a global release of nitric oxide. It's this gas, this signaling molecule sort of everywhere in the body, and it pushes stress hormones out of our system. Why is this a big deal? There are 9 known causes of aging. What do they have in common? Inflammation. All of them are problems that are related to inflammation. What causes inflammation? Predominantly stress. So anytime you can fight stress, fight inflammation, this is powerful anti-aging technologies, and flow does all of this stuff. So massive boost to the immune system, massive reset to the nervous system, huge anti-aging benefits across the board.
Hmm. You're making me want to go outside and play right now. What have they actually studied? I mean, it sounds like at least indirectly they've more or less proven that there's a huge correlation between flow in longevity, but that have they structured any studies around that you know of, like the
Yeah,
relationship
so
between
so
flowing?
interestingly,
Yeah,
yeah, the very Mihai Csikszentmihalyi passed away a couple years ago during
yeah.
COVID. His last study just came out. couple. It was done with his longtime collaborator Gene Nakamura and another gentleman whose name I'm forgetting, but it was on flow proneness over time. And the Csikszentmihalyi wanted to know. It's what they call the continuity hypothesis. Do we stay as hungry for flow in our later years as always? Does it play as big of a role? And it was actually so where this book came from. I've been doing this work for about 20 years, but the actual impetus, the kickoff, was my last conversation with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which was about this study. I didn't know we were talking about it. It was only like after he passed and I saw the study come out, I realized that was why we were having the conversation we were having. But yeah, so flow proneness, it stays the same in our later years. The only time it starts to fall off is as if our body, if we don't train up our physical abilities, right? They're all use it or lose it skills. And we would, our physical stuff will fall off a cliff. So, the decline starts in our 20s and 30s. By our 50s, it accelerates. We can stave it off with proper training. But if you don't, when it falls off, when our bodies start to fall apart, we can't access flow the way we normally want to. That's the only change that happens.
Yeah.
But in this study, it was like constant into late 80s kind of thing.
So did they also show a correlation between regular flow and longevity itself in any of these studies, or
I
has
don't
that?
nothing that I've seen. Now, I would bet some studies have been done. But I can't think of any off the top of my head. But I would guess somebody's poked at it along the way. Though Csikszentmihalyi is often first, and he, you know what I mean. His interest late in life, might have been one of the first people there. Certainly, we're starting to look at it. I mean, at the Flow Research Collective, we're looking at it very seriously and are interested in these questions.
Is the Flow Research Collective? Are you involved in any like research currently?
Uh, so we have a fairly sizable research department.
Oh, cool.
We do studies with, I mean, folks at Stanford, folks at UCLA, USC, Imperial College London, UC, SF, a bunch of universities in Florida, a bunch of other stuff. So yeah, we have a lot of ongoing studies. We've got flow and pain studies that we're working on. We're working on flow and intuition studies. We're looking at flow and caffeine studies. We've got an interesting story. So at the heart of my work in Gnar Country and late in life skill acquisitions was a modified idea. So the challenge skills balance. Flow states have triggers, right? We talked about that, I think, the last time we were together. Preconditions that lead to more flow. And if you want more flow in your life, the triggers are your toolkit. And one of the most famous is the challenge skills balance.
Yeah.
And the idea is that flow follows focus. It can only show up when all our attention is the right here, right now. The triggers do that. They drive attention in the present moment. And the challenge skills balance says we pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set. You want to stretch, but not snap. Now, metaphorically, not scientifically, metaphorically, that's about a 5% gradient difference. We find the most flow as a general rule when the challenge of the task is about 5% greater than our skill set. One of the things that we realized at the collective was that because of allostatic load, which is literally the impact of trauma and stress over time on our physiology and our psychology, that we think that challenge skill spot has shrunken in older adults, and people don't realize it. They still feel like it's where it is, but it's actually a lot smaller. And so in one of the things that we did is in trying to onboard new physical skills late in life, we had people go very, very slowly. One inch at a time was the motto. And it was because of this shrunken challenge skill spot. And we figured just by honoring that and saying, hey, this is shrunk down, we're going to get more people into flow. Flow massively amplifies learning, right? 250% to 500% above baseline, depending on whose numbers you're going by. So we knew that if we could get people into flow, the state itself will take care of the learning. So we wanted people to move really, really slowly. It worked incredibly well, but we didn't measure. You can measure allostatic load using a whole bunch. Heart rate variability will get there. A bunch of other stuff will get there. We didn't in our early research. we were still proving out the learning theory and things like that. We weren't measuring a lot of physiological data. But we are now going back and redoing those early studies and measuring physiological data so we can put more accurate numbers on that stuff. So that's one of the things we're doing in the peak performance aging category.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I'm curious specifically, what are you looking at between the relationship with flow and intuition?
So we published 4 or 5 months ago a big, like 100-page uh, um, paper in Neuroscience and Biobehavior Reviews about what goes on in the brain as we transition into a flow state. It was sort of a
Hmm.
neural dynamical look at what happens in the brain as we transition into a flow state. And that work gave us a really good look at sort of what happens as we move into flow. One of the things that we know happens in flow is intuition gets cranked up really loud and tends to be fairly accurate.
Hmm.
So we started asking the question, why is that in flow and how does it correlate and relate? And we started out looking at just what is intuition in the brain and how does it work and what's a neural dynamical picture of intuition. And we're working on papers on that front. And then the next question right downstream from that is, why is flow so much more accurate why is intuition so much more accurate when we're in flow? And some of this actually dovetails nicely with some other peak performance aging research on sort of interoception. So people
Hmm.
who are better at interoception, listening to their internal signals, and we measure that by, like, can you count your heartbeats, right, during a given minute? How accurate are, and people who are better at that tend to have, among other things, better pattern recognition
Hmm.
skills, and but they also tend to be able to make decisions under conditions of risk with less bias. So better interoception
Hmm.
skills translates to less bias. So one of the questions that we've been having about flow is, does flow turn up interoceptive awareness in that way? Is it related to this finding or not? And nobody knows, but that's stuff we're poking at.
So, is there then a relationship between listening to something that's coming from inside of you and increased intuitive capabilities? Because I guess it makes sense that intuition
Well,
is something that comes from the inside, but the fact that there's some relationship between some signal
so
inside of
I
you.
mean, you have
Yeah.
to remember that anytime I mean, the fact that we know that pattern recognition, which is at the heart of intuition, creativity, and all that stuff, there's none of it without pattern recognition. The fact that pattern recognition gets massively amplified in people who are better at interoception skills, um, that's a very telling. That's something that's very, very, very telling, because that's something that also um, amplified pattern recognition and lowered bias would give you more accuracy in intuition. Now, there's a lot of like caveats with intuition also. So this is well known. If you're getting an intuition that is actually talking about an instinct, so if you're getting an intuition and it's about something that you have an instinctive relationship to, don't trust it at all.
Hmm.
Then you're really subject to bias.
So what would
So
an example of that be?
uh, like if so, instincts that are sex is a basic instinct, right? The
Okay.
urge to procreate. So if you're in a bar and you think that girl or that guy is hot for you,
Yeah.
don't trust that
You're wrong.
instinct.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
it's
Okay.
because dopamine clouds instinct. So dopamine amplifies pattern
Hmm.
recognition, does a bunch of stuff, but it tends to cloud instinct. Hunger, as we know, can really tilt us, our game, and some of those other things. Thirst, like, the basic drivers tend to cloud instinct.
Yes, I would imagine there's an inverse correlation between high dopamine levels and hangriness. And when you're at that level, don't trust yourself. Don't eat the cake.
Yeah, don't. I mean, never trust the dopamine is always good advice.
Man, we haven't even said what this whole thing revolves around, which is that at the age of 53, you decided to start going off of extraordinarily dangerous jumps and do like park skiing. And this is why I said, you at the beginning of this, you put your balls out there, you put yourself on the line. You were the guinea pig in this in a very real way, not just like Yeah, I'll do some experiments, but I'll actually throw my bones off of some jumps for a book. Um, so so that's pretty crazy.
It was crazy. It was also, when I came into this, right, I was looking at all the lab studies and all the research, and the research was really, really clear that how we put it together was unusual, right? We blended stuff from embodied cognition and network neuroscience and flow science and a whole bunch of stuff to come up with our learning protocol. But everything said that using this protocol, older adults should be able to onboard even seemingly impossible physical skills. And park skiing was perfect because there's a general feeling that if you haven't learned it by 30, 35, it's very, very, very difficult. By 40 or 50, it's for about 12 different biological reasons, quote unquote. It's considered downright impossible. So it was a great way to test it. And the other thing is, I had a bunch of motivation that way, right? If you're going into this kind of experiment, you want as much fire as you possibly could. And I had some unfinished business in skiing, right? I talk about that in the book, but there was extra fire going in, and I think that's useful in these style quests. But I also think, first of all, there's a lot of, one of the things that I point out in the book is action sports are actually phenomenal for peak performance aging. That
Hmm.
big formula I gave you earlier,
Yeah.
right? Action sports tick almost every box in that formula, which is also why when you look at like the longest lived communities in America, like top three: Summit, Pitkin, and Eagle County, Colorado, home to like Vail, Aspen, Beaver Creek, you're right, all these outdoor meccas. Um, Even Loma Linda, California, which is another blue zone area, a big, huge hiking outdoor community there, as well. So you see it sort of, these outdoor communities tend to be very, very long-lived communities because these activities are really actually great for health and longevity if you do them safely, right?
Yeah.
Um,
So that
so
formula again was novel outdoor
yeah, so
environments, challenge.
yeah, so now that we've talked a little bit, let's
Yeah.
break it down. We want to rock till we drop. We want to regularly engage in challenging, creative, and social activities that demand dynamic, deliberate play and take place in novel outdoor environments. So let's go like trilogy at a time.
Yeah.
Challenging, creative, and social activities. So, um, a couple things. Challenging activities tend to trigger flow. Creative activities tend to trigger flow. Social activities can trigger flow if you're doing them right, but social activities are phenomenal. They're requirements, not just for peak performance in general, but definitely for peak performance aging. In fact, having a robust social life and maintaining robust social connections is almost mandatory if you want
Hmm.
to hold on to both physical and cognitive function later in life. So usually important. Dynamic, deliberate play. So dynamic is this funny word, but I remember I said earlier that there are all these use it or lose it skills, right? On the physical side, what that says is there's 5 that matter: strength, stamina, flexibility, agility, and balance.
Hmm.
Those are the 5 that sort of fall under the heading functional fitness. Sometimes you see balance in that, or sometimes it's out. Sometimes you just see agility, which is balance at speed, or they go back and forth. I like to break it out because they're you can train them a little differently. But the point is, dynamic is a single word that means all 5 of these categories. So dynamic activities, you just want to train all 5 of these things, right? And skiing is a dynamic activity. It trains all 5 at once, which is fabulous. Deliberate play is the opposite. We've heard deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is one great way to get towards expertise. Expertise is really important when you talk about peak performance aging because one of the reasons lifelong learning is so important is expertise and wisdom actually are the 2 most neuroprotective characteristics we can develop. The reason is if you're going to get Alzheimer's, you're going to get dementia, you're going to suffer cognitive decline, the problem's probably in your prefrontal cortex.
Hmm.
That's where most of the damage shows up. So if you really, really want to stave off cognitive decline, you want to neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, and synaptic plasticity. You want those neurons to form these really complicated neural networks. networks. Now, one of the properties of the brain and with neural networks in general is redundancy. The brain doesn't ever figure out one way to do something. It figures out like a dozen different, slightly different modified ways to do things, right? And this is very true with expertise. So lifelong learning really matters a lot because it forms these complicated diffuse networks in the prefrontal cortex. Expertise and wisdom are how we stave off cognitive decline. Education level matters for that reason. Another finding from the Sisters of Notre Dame studies: education level correlates to expertise and wisdom, and one of the ways we stave off cognitive decline. So, dynamic, deliberate play, deliberate practice is one way of gaining expertise, right? And it's repetition with incremental advancement. But it turns out, for really onboarding expertise, deliberate play outperforms deliberate practice. Deliberate play is repetition with improvisation, right?
Cool.
You're doing what you did before and you're just improvising a little bit. And the playfulness, there's all kinds of benefits for play, especially later in life, but massively amplifies learning. You get a whole bunch of more neurochemistry when it comes to play, and a lot less self-consciousness, a lot less fear, a lot less shame. So all the things that block learning, and a whole bunch more kind of reward neurochemistry that amplify motivation and help with learning. So that's the dynamic deliberate play. And one other thing I want to mention: dynamic activities, when your brain has to sort of coordinate strength and power and balance and agility, also amplify neurogenesis and angiogenesis. Angiogenesis is the birth of new vasculature. So getting new neurons is great, but you want new blood vessels so they can get oxygen to those neurons. And dynamic activities gives you those two things. And then novel outdoor environments, as you pointed out, they're very flowy, right? Novelty is a flow trigger. They have two additional benefits. One, you know this from positive psychology: time in nature lowers stress levels and amplifies the production of serotonin, right? So time in nature lowers stress, and stress links to inflammation, which links to aging. So that's great. We get this kind of mood benefit. But additionally, I said a second ago, we want neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons. Where do we get neurogenesis in the adult brain? Predominantly out of the hippocampus. The hippocampus. What did you say?
I said mushrooms.
Mushrooms. Well, the Terence McKenna theory on neurogenesis.
I think,
but most of it,
there have
even
been
if we're going to
studies on
take,
that, actually.
yeah, but even if we're going to get, that's actually come out of most of those new neurons, right, are coming out of the hippocampus, which does long-term memory, but it also does place. So we evolved as hunter-gatherers, right? Our brain is designed to remember, like, where were we? In what outdoor environment were we when we found that ripe fruit tree? We were starving all winter and there was a ripe fruit tree. Or where was that watering hole? Or where did we get attacked by the tiger so we don't have to go back there again? So if you really want to amplify neurogenesis, you want to have you want to have emotionally charged experiences in novel outdoor environments, because it just gets our biology working for us even further. So that's sort of the formula in a sentence, and you see the psychological ties underneath all of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would have thought it totally makes sense that these things are like neuroprotective and good for your brain, because when you're in a novel environment, your brain just needs to be paying attention, more alert. Where am I? What is that over there? Like, don't fall down the hill. But you're actually saying that it's like it creates new brain cells, that you can have neurogenesis from these things. That's super interesting. I was going to ask you, before you explained all of that, if there's any relationship between flow and neurogenesis, but it sounds like there's at least a relationship between activities that are flow triggers and neurogenesis, but maybe not flow itself, or maybe also flow itself. I don't know.
You know what? It's a great question. And so I have never seen a study on it. It is hard to measure neurogenesis, right? Which was one of the reasons it took so long for us to figure out. Um, but we've gotten really good at, like, we know the two spots in the brain that continue to produce neurons, and then the adult brain does, like, your brain will produce like 700 new neurons a day until pretty much the day you die. You can get more, and you could hang on to, so you get synaptic pruning over time. So synapses fall away, brain connections fall away, but you can maintain them also using this formula. And I bet we see flow playing a huge role, but I've never seen studies. It sounds like something that we should look at. I don't
Yeah.
quite know how to do it. I have to think more about that. And I don't know. One of the things that we've been wanting to do a lot and we haven't yet done is create sort of a questionnaire, some kind of study guide that allows us to figure out people who have had very high flow lifestyles. So one of the questions we've been asking is, we know through Richard Davidson's work at University of Wisconsin, like there's changes in the brains of longtime meditators.
Yeah.
And so we want to know, are there similar changes in the brain of people who have regular access to flow over a long period of time? So we've been trying to figure out a way to develop a questionnaire that sort of can isolate those people. And if we could, then we could start asking these longevity questions, these neurogenesis questions. So they're these ideas are downstream from research that we're already working on. But really cool question.
Yeah, and I think they've done positive psychology studies to that effect also, where they've looked at brains of people who are, very high in positive affect, and there seems to be I don't remember, like the neurological features associated with that, but I thought that there was like increased brain health that they've measured associated
Well,
with
so
positive affect.
yeah, a lot of this is stuff that's downstream from Barbara Friedrichsen's work on the broad and build theory. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea,
I'm
but
not,
it's
no.
so it's really cool. It's so positive emotions when we have real the love, hope, mastery, those really the best emotions that are available. They broaden us out, meaning when we have these feelings, we think sort of different thoughts and we notice new ideas, and this builds us and makes us more resilient over time because we're developing new options and new skills. So you find out that there's this broad and build theory where people with positive thoughts makes brains much more resilient over time, and they've done a lot of work on the kind of neurobiological correlates of that resilience that come off the broad and build theory. And that sounds like some of the work that you're talking about as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah, it could be. It totally could be. One of the things I keep meaning to bring back up that you briefly mentioned, but I just think it's so fascinating, is that Langer study. Like that to me
Oh
is
my God.
it's one of the
Well,
most amazing. Yeah.
all of her work. I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with her stuff besides the counterclockwise study, which I'll talk about in a second. But I mean, if you want to talk about the mind body connection, her work is some of the wildest stuff that's ever been done. But the counterclockwise study, I think we beat her by running a more radical peak performance aging experiment
Hmm.
than she designed. But before we came along, the counterclockwise study wins. So the idea is, little history is helpful. She when Ellen Langer comes into psychology, she comes in studying questions around language and priming and bias. And she starts seeing there's a huge impact on like health, and but because of language and priming, and she starts to wonder how much of aging is the result of like negative language priming and these kinds of things. And she wants to know how much of like health or vitality or youth might be the result of like health priming. So she designs this crazy study known as the counterclockwise study. It's 1981, and she takes 16 late 70s and 80-year-old men uh, to a monastery in New Hampshire, puts them in a van, drives them up to this monastery. And the monastery, it's 1981, has been completely transformed. It looks like 1961 in the
Hmm.
monastery. It's 20 years earlier inside the monastery. And all the books in the monastery are 20 years old, and the magazines are 20 years old, and there's movie nights, and they watch films from 20 years ago. And the study takes place for 5 days, and they test them for all kinds of like cognitive health stuff ahead of time and afterwards, physical health ahead of time and afterwards. Here's the study. They divide the groups into two. One group has to sort of reminisce about life 20 years ago. What was it like back in 1961? And the other group has to pretend it's 1961. They have to talk about themselves in the present tense as if they were 20 years younger. They have to talk about like the Cuban Missile Crisis as if it was a current event. And they measure, as I said, everything. And on the back end of the study, the group that play acted like they were 20 years younger, the amount of change is absurd. Their gait improves, their IQ improves, their hearing improves, their vision on a Snelling eye chart improves, their posture improves, their arthritis goes away so much that they become taller and their fingers become longer because they straighten out so much.
Wow.
It goes on and on and on. And the study is so radical that nobody believes it's real, of course. So they rerun it 4 other times, 3 times in Europe, and they make TV shows about it. And the 4th time they reran it, I think in 2019, and the results aren't out yet because of COVID, with like full, like modern, double blind, everything you could possibly do. But it's just a wild, wild, wild study that really gets to like how much aging is a mental event.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant idea. And I wonder if she faced any backlash when she proposed that
Oh,
idea.
I mean, she's faced backlash. So she's faced a lot of backlash her whole career. And she just sort of keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. I mean, that's just one random study. Here's another. I like, she's done a bunch of studies that I'm sure you've heard about, but probably didn't realize it was her. So, you know about the chambermaid study?
I don't think so.
Okay, so this is another one of those famous mind-body connection studies. So Ellen Langer she's thinking about maids, hotel maids, and she's like, being a hotel maid, that's a ton of physical exercise, right? So you would think that hotel maids are in better shape than other, say, blue-collar workers. So she goes out, does a baseline study, and she finds out that no, this isn't true at all. So then she takes a group of, I think it was 84 maids. She tells half of them. So first they figure out like how much you're working and how much exercise you get. Nobody gets a whole lot of exercise. And then she tells half of the group, so 42 maids, about the exercise they're actually getting. No interventions. They just sit them down and say, look, vacuuming is sort of like a rowing machine. Making a bed is sort of right. And they go through all the exercise the maids are actually getting. And then they monitor them for a month to make sure that nobody gets any extra exercise. And then a month later, they come back and they test everybody for physical characteristics. The maids who found out about the exercise that they were doing, they lose weight. Their hip to waist ratio shrinks. Their body mass index, like everything you could possibly imagine. And the only thing that was different is they got told about the exercise they were actually doing. Wild studies like that. She does another study. This is a really funny one about, she takes the Snelling eye chart, which is the standard eye chart, gets wide up here and gets small. And she says, you know what? This primes us to make us believe that our vision is going to get worse because smaller things are towards the bottom. And there's a way within body cognition that the bottom leads to that. So she flips the eye chart around, just flips it around. And now it turns out that when you give people the Snelling eye chart test with it flipped around without that priming that their vision is going to get worse over time, with the letters getting bigger, people test better on this. Your vision improves simply by flipping the chart over. It's crazy. Her work is nuts.
Yeah, that just brings up so many questions about environment and relationship and context. And
here's another one of the Snelling eye chart. You want to talk about that? She realizes that so there's this belief in the military that Air Force pilots have the best vision. So she does a study where she gets ROTC people in a vision study. She uses a Snelling eye chart and she puts them inside of an airplane simulator, and she puts half of her study group in Air Force uniforms. Okay. And instead of using the Snelling eye chart, they're reading tail numbers off a plane that's the exact distance that the Snelling eye chart is. And they find that the people dressed in Air Force uniforms, because they believe that Air Force people have the best vision in the military, they test better on the Snelling eye chart than people who are not wearing costumes.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, nobody's at the Air Force. These are not, they're ROTC. Nobody's a real pilot. They're just being put in Air Force uniforms inside a simulator. But literally, the people in uniforms test better than the people out of uniform. It's so crazy.
Well, this brings up so many questions for me. I mean, primarily is how can you extend these simulacrum environments that make people feel younger? How can you extend that into everyday life is one question. And two, like what is your takeaway from all this? How do you make sense of this?
Well, I make sense of it the same way I sort of always have, which is um, most of our focus, performance wise, over the centuries has been on training the body, right? There's been some cultures where training the mind was really important, but not as a general rule. And it's only been in the past 40 years, 30 years that we're really getting into this. But if you talk to most peak performance experts, they're going to tell you that, especially when you get to sort of the upper levels of talent, performance 90% mental, 95% mental, and we're just starting to figure out what those big levers are.
Mhm.
So what all this means to me is that we're at the front end of this kind of performance revolution based around the brain. We're just starting to figure out how these things work at sort of a real level. I think it gets really exciting and interesting from here. And I'm not even talking about, like, everybody wants to talk about the technological side. Oh, we got brain computer interfaces and those things coming. And sure, maybe whatever. I'm literally just talking about what we're already capable of, that we're starting to figure out the really tight mind body connections and how to sort of really nurture these things. I think we're at the front end of figuring this out.
Do you think, like a lot of the longevity people are saying, that we're about to see a huge lifespan increase, or do you think we're just going to see a health span increase, but not necessarily like everybody's going to be living to 130, 140, 150?
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of those people, and a bunch of those people are friends of mine, and it's I just don't know. You know what I mean? So what I tell people is, like, if you look at longevity science, you look at regenerative medicine, and I write about this in the book a little bit, even though this isn't really what the book is about, but regenerative medicine is a great example. The field started 25 years ago, and I've been experimenting with it and researching about it and writing about it for pretty much the entire time. And it was almost complete bullshit and vaporware until about 5 or 6 years ago,
Hmm.
right? It was nonsense, nonsense. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, it starts to get real in smaller ways. And by today, where I think the field is at, though other people could argue with me and disagree with me, what I say to people is ligaments, tendons, and bones, we've gotten really good at. Like, if you're dealing with like health and longevity stuff up to the level of ligaments, tendons, and bones, we're there. We can pretty much fix it. We can repair it. We can back it up, and we're getting better at it. We can't regrow cartilage yet, but maybe soon. But everything beyond that, people are going to use stem cells to regrow your, like, all that stuff, organ regrowth, organ predict. Some of it's real, and all of it's advancing, but we're not there yet. So until we're there, I'm not buying it. One of the things that I've noticed about science is, and when this could be, we could be talking about VR, we could be talking about AI, we could be talking about stem cells, but like, the gap between the hype and the reality, the hypesters tend to want you to believe it's 5 to 10 years, but the reality tends to be about a generation consistently, 25 to 30 years.
Hmm.
So I'm not saying the stuff we're hearing about isn't real, but by the time it really gets to the mainstream, I'm still thinking it's going to be that generation time frame. So I don't know what that really means. I and I'm also like, I'm not convinced I want to live to be 150. Like,
Yeah.
that may be like too much time for me. I don't know how I feel about that one way or another.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It really
I have these. I'm also very curious about what comes next.
Yeah, well,
So,
I'm with you
right.
on that. I'm with you on that. But yeah, and I'm also with you on this idea of I know what 100 looks like 'cause my grandfather made it to 100, and the last few years are rough. The last few years are rough. Like his mental faculty stayed, but he had macular degeneration. He had trouble getting around. He needed help doing a lot of things, and in some ways having your mental faculties through all of that might be worse, and it's because you know you're being a burden. You know that like you every time you are going to the bathroom someone needs to like be it's just it's rough, it's
And
rough.
we are,
So
I mean, that stuff we are getting better at, right? Like there's an elder care robot revolution happening right now. It's mainly being driven in Japan, where they don't, there aren't that many, there's not a
yeah,
replacement generation, right?
huge population
And
decline.
huge population decline and they're aging. And they're also the world leader in robotics. So now they're the world leader in elder care robotics. And stuff is getting really good. And we're figuring out how to hang on to our physical faculties a lot later in life. We're figuring out how to deal with things like macular degeneration, things like that. So, um, I'm not one way or the other. I'm optimistic. I like where we're trending. I just like the longevity science hype is a little hypey for me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is hard to separate hope and promises from reality. I mean, I've talked to some of these people over the years too, and they always have great anecdotes and great examples, but then you're just like, but where is it? And also the speed of healthcare innovation is just disgustingly slow. It takes forever to get anything done or for anything to turn that ship. It just seems like it takes forever. But well, I do want to go back to that to another question I fired your way, and then I fired another one your way. Is have you given thought to how you could possibly extend some of these things from the Langer studies into everyday life? Like, could you do things to extend these, like, just feeling younger into your own life, apart from like redoing your apartment like it's from the decade when you were in the best shape and
Yeah,
you're
so
only.
this is well, Alan Langer has actually left Harvard over the past and is involved in a project to do sort of just that.
Interesting.
So people are looking at that. I don't know what the results are, and obviously, I don't even know what we should elder care facilities, retirement homes, like whatever. Like all our terminology is bad for what we're assisted living facilities, whatever it is. The terminology is probably bad, but a lot of this stuff. Um, a lot of the people, some of the folks who are really involved in that community are really interested in these ideas. So there's a lot of actual innovation in that community in the businesses. So yes is the answer. Like we're already seeing it, but also like I think Gnar Country, this book is one of the first. Now I'm not the only person who've said this. Like if you read Daniel Levitin, recently wrote Successful Aging, is a neuroscientist out of McGill, and um, I think we probably read the same 5,000 studies. You know what I mean? His
Hmm.
book, my book, I ran a bunch of really radical experiments and took it a little bit farther, but the conclusions are no different, right? Because the data's out there, right? People are starting to learn. I think Gnar Country is the first time anybody takes it really, really far and just sort of like says what like the writing is on the wall and what we've been seeing. I think a little bit of a bolder stance. So I think, let's see where we are 10 years from now, because this is still sort of radically new information. But and certainly one thing, I mean, we are going to be older, whatever the hell that means, for a lot longer than our ancestors, and probably a lot longer than we expected, right? Are we going to live to 150? Who the hell knows? But are we going to live longer than we expect to live? Chances are that answer is yes. And chances are, like, the quality of your later years really matters. And,
Yes, it does.
we are now starting to figure out how to take massive advantage of it. The other thing is, like, this is the other thing is our version of it. Not only are there use it or lose it skills, but we actually gain a bunch of cognitive superpowers going into our 50s, right? The brain changes in good ways too. We get access to whole new levels of intelligence and creativity, empathy, and wisdom starting in our 50s.
Hmm.
And some of the brain changes like peak in our 80s. This is new information to a lot of people, and how to really fully capitalize on it and take advantage of it is an open, interesting question, which I think we're at the front end of as well.
Yeah, there's an inward growth that begins to occur. And I mean, in different ways. This is like, Jung would talk about this all the time, that once you reach the second half of your life and you start having, the proverbial midlife crisis, the answer, I mean, well, I guess this might fly in the face a little bit of your whole thesis here, but his argument was the answer is not to try to grasp onto your youth, it's to try to go deeper into the self. But I think there's
Yeah,
a
there's
balance there. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's both and. I think I so one, I mean, you got to remember there's a massive difference in healthcare from like when Young was writing in the
Oh yeah.
30s, the 40s, and today, right? So it was, probably better advice then than now. I mean, the same peak performance aging advice would have worked then as now, and same with the training advice and everything else. That has not changed. But our healthcare has changed. A lot of other things have changed that have made sort of a richer second half much more possible. But what I'm thinking about. I have a friend, Rebecca Rush. So she's a very famous action sport athlete. They called her the Queen of Pain. She was a 7-time world mountain bike champion. She was a world champion orienteer, adventure racer, on and on and on. And she just won the human-powered Iditarod. There's a
Oh
human
wow.
version of the Iditarod, like the dog sled
Wow.
race, right?
So she's
There's a
pulling a
human power
sled actually?
she with a on a bicycle, on a winter
Jesus.
bicycle. They right, and she did it, and she won this past year. I want to say she did it 55, 54, or 53. I can't remember how. And the press made her age the story. Rebecca Rush wins human powered Iditarod despite being 54 years old or whatever. That was the story everywhere nationally. And if you talk to Rebecca, she would just laugh. She's like, I got to tell you something. I couldn't have done this at 40 or 45, or it's the wisdom and the knowledge that I've accumulated over time. I could only have won this race right now. And I will tell you the same thing. Like, I am, as an athlete, I'm performing better right now at 55 than I ever have in my entire life. And some of it is that wisdom, that internal turning being applied to physical challenges as well. So I think there's a lot of advantages that come in the performance vein from it, the empathy, the wisdom, the creativity, and the intelligence we get over time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not too far off from heading into the dreaded 40s decade, and I got to say I feel pretty fucking good too, despite the lack of caffeine I mentioned. But other than that, I feel pretty good. I still work out all the time. I'm still active, and I don't see any reason why I'm going to want to slow down. But you're just getting me fired up. You're just backing up everything I'm already thinking, and I love that it's not just going to be placebo, because I can go to all this evidence that you're laying out there for everybody. So thanks for coming back on, Stephen. This is I just love talking to you. You're such a wealth of knowledge. Um, and as we approach the great hereafter of this mind meld, I'm gonna throw you a quick curveball and ask you what you meant by you're looking forward to what comes next. Because for whatever reason, I didn't peg you as a person who was like, I don't know, I just didn't.
Well, I always say when it comes to all these things, I'm wildly curious and very agnostic. Right. I don't think I have any of those answers. I'm not so sure who has those answers. And I mean, maybe nothing comes next, but I've always sort of suspected there might be something more. And I'm really curious. Um, I'm really interested in seeing, what's next. My wife assures me there's skiing and dogs and laughter in the afterlife. So if she's right, then I'm very, very excited.
Yes, if I'm with you on that. I actually grew up skiing. I haven't skied in years. My dad was a huge skier, and he took me starting from the age of 3, and I probably skied all the way through like middle school, and then I dabbled in snowboarding and stuff. I've wanted to get back into it, so you're kind of fired me up for that too. But I'm with you, man, and I don't think I've had any. personal experiences that have for sure um, made it tangible to me, where I think for sure there must be something more. But I've always leaned that way. I've always leaned, toward the mysterium tremendum of there being something more to consciousness, something more to life. And I'm not sure what that is, but I'm with you where I feel an inkling. I feel an inkling for sure.
It's funny because I've done a tremendous like I can if you go through near death experiences, I can explain go through like most of those phenomenon and link them to biology.
Hmm.
Which does so it doesn't like it's funny like the things people point to is like, oh, here's where I think like look at this and look at this and look at this. Usually I can explain most of it away if you want those explanations using biology. I've always said that just because there's biology underneath it doesn't mean like it's proof one way or another of
Right.
any of the bigger why questions. Um, but I've still got that same inkling. So could be wrong. We're gonna find out.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting too.
Have you ever heard of the work? It's in the book After, and I'm trying to think of the doctor's name. He is a tenured psychiatrist somewhere, and his name is slipping my mind right now. But his book is called After, and he's done the most exhaustive research on near death experiences. Like he's been in the room with cardiac arrests and people who have come back, and he's got a whole book on just many, many stories and a lot of data if you ever want to go down that rabbit
I'll
hole.
check it out. Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
that.
All right, my friend. Well, thank you
Thank you,
again.
Michael.
And
Be
it's
well.
always fun.